This week on Cloud Slaw, we're going to learn about a cool way to standardize some of our security settings across all of our accounts. Okay, it's time to address the gremlin in the room from our lab on implementing block public access. Now, I realize some of you out there were like, wait, this thing restricts access and it can work retroactively and even override all my other IAM and resource policies, but I don't write it in JSON. And what kind of strange beast hath AWS wrought? Block Public Access, or BPA for short, is a bit of a weird one. And it's even weirder now that AWS has added it for snapshots and even VPCs. And that's a big one we're going to get to later. Something you might have picked up on as we've gone along is that a lot of the times when we're configuring things in the console, we're defining configuration settings for various services. Like way back when we turned on CloudTrail, we set it up as an organization trail, pointed it to an S3 bucket, and set up some other things. And while we were using API calls via our clicky in the console, these API calls are just setting up the configuration. The way to think about BPA is as another one of those configuration settings, but for security. Now, if you recall the IAM policy evaluation logic, and we covered that in our resource control policies lab, that shows how all of the IAM and resource-based and service control policies interact to approve or deny something. BPA is not part of that flow. It's simply a setting that says, can this bucket have anything that's public? It's a checkbox. It's a state definition. Call it what you want, but that's why it can't be circumvented by some new IAM policy. It's on for its various states of on, or it's off. And these are what we call security invariants that prevent bad things from happening. Invariants because they can't change. Well, you can change them, but they can't be changed once they're set. So, cool. How do we manage these things at scale, especially when there might be other security and operations related configurations we'd like to consistently enforce across our organization? Well, there's the old way and the new way. And the old way hurt a lot. We'd have to set baseline configurations, we'd deploy those out there with infrastructure as code, and then we'd lock them down with service control policies or some kind of identity-based policies to make sure nobody could change them. And heck, for a lot of things, this is still the only way we can enforce consistent configurations. But as of a few weeks before I'm recording this, we've got a new hotness, and that is called declarative policies. Released in December of 2024, declarative policies enforce desired configuration states for certain AWS services. How does it do this? I'm thinking elves, maybe pixies. Here's how to think of them in relation to the other kinds of policies that we've covered. IAM policies, or permissions policies, define what someone can do. Permissions boundaries define the max amount of things they can possibly do, but doesn't give them actually permissions to do any of it. Service control policies is similar and defines the maximum actions that can be allowed in an account without giving anybody permission to do anything. Resource policies define access and actions allowed on a resource, and resource control policies do the same thing, but like service control policies, they define the maximum actions and access that are allowed for resources in an account. Remember, we can do this across multiple accounts thanks to organizational units and our little organizations hierarchy. Well, if you think back to that policy evaluation logic, all of these things work together to define if any given API call or any given remote access is allowed. And Amazon calls these authorization policies as a group, since it's all about authorizing something, and enforcement only happens when someone or something tries to do something. Well, now we get to add in declarative policies. Declarative policies define and enforce certain configuration settings for certain services, mostly ones that are interesting to us in security. They're not authorization policies. They actually define like what the settings are in the configurations in all of our various accounts. Some things they can control are block public access for VPCs, which AMIs, which images are allowed, blocking use of version 1 of the metadata service. And these are very cool. Like, I can't wait for our VPC block public access lab. EBS allowed images is also possibly one of the most important one for enterprises because they can now enforce which baseline images are allowed to be used. And this was really hard to do and enforce consistently and effectively before these declarative policies were released. Now, you can only allow people to use approved and secure images, or you can require version 2 of the instance metadata service in every account and every VPC. So, even though there's not a ton of options, at least when I'm recording this in declarative policies, the ones that are in there are very impactful. Now, one caveat as of this writing, S3 block public access isn't supported. I think it's either a fear over the ability to break S3 at scale, or because block public access for S3 has both account and bucket level settings that have to be managed. All right, little more on declarative policies before we get into the labs. Declarative policies are written in JSON naturally, and they are handled in your management account. You can actually delegate out all this policy administration, but we're not going to get into that today. You apply them to organizational units and accounts, just like service control policies or resource control policies. The service also has a feature to do a pre-check and see what the impact might be if you go ahead and roll out the policy. That's really important, and we're going to show that in the lab that we do today because we've actually used some of these settings. So, what are the key points today? Declarative policies enforce desired configuration states for certain AWS settings and services. It's a small list today, but I'm pretty sure it's going to grow. They enable us to have baseline configurations that are enforced throughout our entire organization, or at least where we want them. These are largely security related settings like block public access. Well, that's the background on these security invariants, as we like to call them. And heck, you can even look up my Amazon reInvent talk I did with Chris Ferris if you want to learn more about those security invariants. Let's go ahead and jump into the lab. This lab is fairly straightforward. The first thing we need to do is create an S3 bucket that Declarative Policies is going to use to run an assessment on our organization. And that's really just to tell us where we've already turned things on or off. We haven't really used too many of those features yet, so we're probably going to show up as being nice and clean. But in any of my real existing environments, I probably have a lot of those results that would be showing up. Then we'll turn on Declarative Policies. We're going to run that assessment. And when we get the results, we're going to look at those, and then we'll go ahead and actually enable declarative policies. We're going to do everything in the management account, and we could do delegated administration for a lot of this, but for these policy management at this high level, I'm typically okay running that in the management account, but remember, your organization may do things differently. With that, log into your sign-in portal. From the sign-in portal here, I'm going to go to my Cloud S.L.A.W. By the way, you probably notice I have an extra little account here that's been in a few of these labs. That's just because of that's where I was doing some work for a presentation I gave at Amazon's reInvent conference here in 2024. Some of you might be watching this in later years. I'm going to go to Cloud S.L.A.W. and Administrator Access. Once we're here, I'm going to go right to S3. So it's on my pick list, or you can type in S3 in the box there. Let's go to S3. And you can see I was doing some experimentation work. I actually had an existing bucket. That one is not the one I want to use. It's in the incorrect region. I have to actually do this in US East. So this was a valuable lesson for me. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch to US East. And at the end of this, we're going to switch back just to make sure we're not stuck with our bucket in the wrong place. And we're going to go create bucket. So we're going to go with a general purpose bucket. And by the way, the reason this has to be in East, it just has to deal with global services. The global services like declarative policies run in US East, even though they aren't quite labeled that way. What we want to do is the bucket name. So I'm going to call it declarative, and to make this one easier, results dash our mogul dash some random numbers, just because our S3 buckets need to be unique names. This is going to be all private. We're going to leave block public access turned on. We're not going to bother with bucket versioning, encryption, or any of that, and create bucket. Now, we do need to then click on that bucket. And you know what? Let's clean this up a little bit. I'm going to take this bucket here, and there's nothing in it, so I can just go ahead and delete it. This was the one I was doing before. And that was part of my testing as I was prepping for this lab. I just forgot to clean that up. All right, we're going to go into this bucket that I just created, and we're going to click on it, and we're going to go to permissions, and then bucket policy. I'm going to edit my bucket policy. And I've got it in the blog post. It actually comes from Amazon's own documentation. So let me pause to make sure I've got the right one to paste in. Okay, so I pulled this policy off of my clipboard here. You guys can get it from the blog post. And there's two changes we need to make. First, we need to put in the ARN of our bucket, the one we're in. It is conveniently right up here because Amazon realized, yeah, that's something people have to look for a lot. Let me click on that, and I'm going to paste it in, and I'm going to double check that I still have that slash and that asterisk. The other thing is, look here, it needs our account ID. That's also easy to get. Go in the upper right-hand corner, click on account ID, click that little copy, and I'm going to overlap here, paste it in, and my account ID is, whoops, I got to get rid of that extra Y, and my account ID is in there. Now you'll notice that it gives me a warning. It's a wildcard without a like operator. That's okay. This is exactly from Amazon's documentation. So if this doesn't work, you're going to see my angry face on this video. And double check all of that. That looks good. Save changes. Now we're going to go into Amazon organizations. And before we do that, I want to click up here. This is important. Go back to Oregon. Why? Because this is going to set the default in your browser for a while, and we don't want you to have any errors popping up anymore. So what the heck? It just bounced me back over. That's a new behavior in Amazon S3. So interesting. Well, I'm going to cut that out of the manual instructions. We'll come back to that later. I've never had to do that before. I'm going to go to organizations. So click up in that area and go to organizations. And from here, we can turn on our declarative policies. So I'm going to go to the policies on the left sidebar, go down to declarative policies. Look, they're in alphabetical order. Click on declarative policies, and we're going to enable them for EC2 in our organization. So the policies are enabled, but we still have to run our scan to make sure we're not going to break anything when we turn that declarative policy on. So let's go to Actions, View Account Status Report. We don't have one. Generate Status Report. Now to generate the report, we need to tell it which S3 bucket to use. So we're going to go to Browse S3, and we have declarative results that we just created. I'm going to choose that. And no errors this time. Yay. Last time I had that wee bit of error. Oh, I might get an error after I do this part. We'll see. Then I'm going to click on root. We're going to run this on our entire organization. Now, if you have a real large organization with a lot of stuff going on, you might only run this on part of your organization, like just an OU or even an individual account. You can run this whenever you want because we're just getting started and we know we don't have a lot running in our environment. We don't have any workloads. We're going to just do it for the entire organization. And I'm going to hit submit. No errors. And then now we are waiting for that report to be generated. Now, what's interesting is it's giving me an error here. That's because the report is actually running and it doesn't have a state yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause this video while we're waiting for this report to go ahead and finish. And I'll give you a sense of how long it takes. You can look into my clock. It is 1:48 in the afternoon, and we'll see where we end up. Okay, it looks like we've got some results, and this was built. It took about less than 5 minutes for me to get my results. So if you look at the blog post, you can see these are the various settings, such as the instance metadata defaults. It actually is checking every single region of every single account in our organization. And in our case, the allowed image settings is disabled, instance metadata defaults, everything is basically turned off. So we've not turned on any of these features. Now, you could imagine if we had one of our VPCs running where we said, hey, enforce that it's only IAM instance metadata service version 2 or disable serial console access, that we would have that effect and it would show different results here. But as you can see that when we turn on, we're going to affect every account in every region. Something you might have figured out here as well, these declarative policies are all in the EC2 service. And that's fine because that's where we really want a lot of this focus, but it'll be really interesting to see if maybe even by the time some of you watch this video, that's expanded. Okay, so we have our account status report. And let's go back to declarative policies. The easiest way to navigate is to click up here. And remember, you can create multiple reports. You can keep track of these over time, and they get stored in your S3 bucket, and they just all look as like JSON. So we're going to go to declarative policies for EC2, and I want to create a new policy. So I'm going to click create policy, and I'm going to call it instance metadata service v2 enforced. And you might guess that that's the policy. And only allow instance metadata service v2. So this is going to enforce only version 2 of the instance metadata service. We don't need any tags. And this time, because I don't even know what the JSON is, because I've not written one, we're going to stick with the visual editor. So let's see, service attribute, instance metadata defaults. And the instance metadata default we're going to restrict is, we're going to say enabled, version 2 only, token required. So we're going to basically be shutting down version 1. And we know that we're not worried about that right now. Now, if you're doing this before you did some earlier labs, it might break some things. But we know because we ran that assessment. And we don't have anybody, as far as any running workloads, that are using version 1 of the metadata service. Then there's some other things, access to tags in the metadata. We're going to leave that as no preference, so we're not going to enforce. That would actually restrict the ability to access, for something to access its own tags. And you might use that if you were passing in secrets, for example. And we're going to leave that as no preference on any of these. And then we could add other attributes for EC2, but we're going to stick with just this default, and we're going to leave everything else available to us. Create policy. All right, that quick, that easy. But if I click on this policy, this should look a little bit familiar. It's like our service control policies and our resource control policies. We don't have anything that this is associated with. So we're going to go to targets. We're going to attach it. And we're just going to do it for our production workloads. So I could disable it for everywhere else here, but just for today, we're not going to run this on our entire org. We're going to lock down version 2 of the metadata service in our production workloads. Why is that? Because I might have other labs in the future where I want to allow version 1 of the metadata service as we're experimenting and even creating some vulnerable things for ourselves and doing some testing. So we're just going to run this production workloads and attach policy. And that's it. That's set. And if I go into that particular account and if I try to create a VPC with version 1 of the metadata service, or if I launch an instance with version 1 of the metadata service, that's going to go be disabled. Well, let's go, I'm not sure if I can show that or not. Let's close this out and let's go into our, oh yeah, we don't have an account in that production environment right now. Okay, so it was just that easy. For all of our production workloads, I don't need to worry about the metadata service version 1 being activated anymore. And there's other settings that I could go ahead and lock down, turn off serial console access, all sorts of things. It is all limited to the EC2 service, but this is still really powerful. One great example that I didn't do here, because we're not really fully set up to do this, and it would break some stuff we want to do later, is I could, as I mentioned, enforce the only using predefined images that are pre-approved within my organization so that we have secure baseline images. And the nice thing about declarative policies is, like all of our policy types, you can assign those to individual organizational units or individual accounts. So you could even get down to the level of, hey, in our production accounts, it has to be one of these pre-approved images. But in our development account, we'll let everybody use kind of whatever images they want. Anyway, that's it. I think declarative policies are great. They define configuration settings that otherwise we have to go through and make API calls or manually click, and it allows us to consistently enforce those. As I add production accounts or accounts to that production organizational unit, this is going to be consistently enforced. We'll probably play more with these later, but I just wanted to give us a taste for it, get us set up, and understand how to do the assessment to make sure that we know what is currently being set in all of those accounts before we do something that could potentially break something. Hope you enjoyed this one. Have a great week, or a great 2 weeks, because we're in our 2-week cycle right now, and we'll see you soon.